Thank you, everybody, for coming to the July meeting of the Library Marketing Book Club. Really appreciate you taking the time to come here. And we're so excited to have our guest here, author Tamsen Webster. It is just absolutely awesome. We just love having authors here. And Tamsen, after listening to the book and hearing you and hearing you speak and other things, it's just so cool that you're here. So Tamsen is a part message designer, part English to English translator, part magpie. Tamsen Webster helps leaders craft their case for large-scale change. In addition to her work in and for major organizations such as Harvard Med School, Fidelity Investments, a big one here in Jacksonville, and Clavia. She's a judge and mentor for the Harvard Innovation Labs, a professional advisor at the Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship, and has spent over 10 years as the idea strategist for one of only 9 legacy-level TEDx events in the world. She was named to the Thinkers 50 radar in 2022 and is the author of 2 books, though I think there's a third, Find Your Red Thread.
Well, the second one's coming in October.
Oh, that's the second one. Okay. So Find Your Red Thread, make your big ideas irresistible, which is the one we read. And the one that's coming, Say What They Can't Unhear, the 9 Principles of Lasting Change. She lives in Boston with her husband, 2 sons, and 2 Brindle greyhounds, Hazel and Walnut. So welcome, Tamsen. Thank you so much for joining us.
I am delighted to be here. Hello, hello.
And thanks. If you'd like to say a little hello to the group, a little welcome or something, that would be wonderful.
Sure. By which you mean like a quick overview of things?
Just a little thing. Yeah. What's happening? What's going on?
Yeah, sure. Hey, it's cloudy here in Boston State. Walnut is on a couch in front of me and dreaming. So it's very possible that you will hear like a little snuffle woof in the back. And as I was saying to Chris before we got on the call, I was not born and raised in Boston, but I have now lived here long enough to officially have a Bostonian alter ego named Karen O'Sullivan. So who goes to loves the Red Sox, Tom Brady, Patriots, hot dogs, doesn't ever go to heaven. So I've spent most of my life at this point, which is, much longer than I'd like to admit it is, but really fascinated by how can we accelerate the understanding and adoption of new ideas. I've looked at that from any number of different perspectives, from nonprofits to for-profits, from a fundraising standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, from a sales standpoint, from an advertising standpoint, from a social and community standpoint. And thanks to a doctoral program I just started this past summer, really looking at it actually from an adult education and organizational learning perspective. And one of the things that when we're thinking about how is it that people understand and adopt new ideas, we know through extraordinary amounts of research at this point that one of the mechanisms, in fact, the primary mechanism by which we make sense of the world is through story, is through the structure of story. So not just once upon a time stories, but actually what is the relationship, the cause and effect relationship between events, actors, outcomes? A lot of these stories happen pre-consciously in our heads, and yet we don't act without them. So one of the things that I say in my new book is that every action ends an internal argument about why that action makes sense, right? So anytime that we do anything, it's because some part of our brain, usually without us realizing it, has said, yep, if I do this, I will get this outcome, therefore I will. So when I was trying to figure out how can I help other people accelerate that understanding and adoption of new ideas, what I was trying to figure out is how can we take any idea and essentially deconstruct it back into its core story elements. The idea being, if we can present an idea in that narrative structure that our brain automatically recognizes, we are essentially uploading this idea directly into the story processors of people's brains. And where my hypothesis was so that we're reducing the likelihood that something gets lost in translation, right? Because we're making sure that what we're explaining or arguing for with an idea has all the elements that it needs to have. So the high level process that you read about in the book and that I came up with was I was looking across all kinds of stories. So not just the hero's journey, which is, yes, prominent in just about every culture, but in our increasingly complex world, the hero's journey isn't always applicable. Because the hero in the hero's journey, as you all probably know very, very well, it's the hero solves it. Like the problem is like, boom, solved. And there's usually a very clear villain. And a lot of times that's just not the case. And so because of my background with kind of complex ideas and complex problems and organizations like libraries and museums and social service organizations where there isn't a villain, right? There are things that you're trying to achieve or to provide from a service standpoint. I was looking for those elements of story. And so what I ended up with was those 5 elements that I talk about in the book, that I believe you can find in any story structure and also in any idea. So those 5 really briefly, I know you know this because you read the book. Number 1, a goal. So any story starts when we understand what the main character wants and doesn't yet have. My favorite example of this, by the way, is Disney musicals. Like, because there's always what musical theater calls an I want song. So it's a great example of that, right? So I grew up in the era of Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. So Little Mermaid is like, I want to be where the people are. I want to see them dance. Right. And then Belle, I am sure, perhaps, I don't want to make any assumptions, but a fan of librarians everywhere, right? So basically saying, I want more than this provincial life, right? So that's how we know that something is starting here because they don't have it. So now we're curious about what happens. The next thing that happens in every story and in every idea is that may be the problem that they know they have, but there's actually some other problem that arises that actually has to get solved now in order for them to get that thing that they want, right? So Ariel loses her voice in order to get the legs. Belle way overcompensates on lack of provincial life, ends up with a beast in a mansion, and that problem has to get solved. Before that the whole story can get resolved there's always some form of what's known as a moment of truth. Aristotle referred to that moment as an anagnorisis. Roughly translated, that means recognition. It's where the main character recognizes the true nature of their circumstances. It's where Dorothy realizes that she always had the power to be home, right? It's where Luke realizes he can use the Force. It's where Ariel realizes that, like, if this is actually love, then it shouldn't actually matter one way or another, however it works. Again, we can argue with the heteronormative structure of Disney musicals from the mid 90s and early 2000s, but this moment of truth always happens. So that needs to be there. And then what does that resolve to? What's the change in thinking or behavior that the main character takes or needs to take in order to get what they want? And then the last piece that I included, because generally this is for business or organizational applications, was the actions. Once they've decided to do something, what do they put in place? And so that's what we did. So that is my super quick overview. And Moana, Mulan. Yes, I should probably figure out how to deconstruct those as well, but they've all got, and Encanto, which is delightful. But that's the speed intro to the red thread, why it exists. And I could talk about it for days and days and days, but let me start with whatever you want to know.
Yeah, no, that's great. So usually we just start to say, anybody want to jump in with Leslie with your thoughts about the book or questions for Tamsen or whatever you got to say.
So, well, thank you, Tamsen, for all of the Disney references, because that really helps all of us to put it into context and understand the story. The challenge that I had as I was reading the book is, in the very first section, you say, what is your idea?
Yeah.
What what is the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And for us, I'm going to speak for everybody here in the library world, we have so many things to offer our communities. We have, hundreds of thousands of books, thousands of resources, thousands of services and programs. And I personally really struggle with how to choose what goal to focus on.
Yeah.
So I'm like just a pinball all day long, like solving all these mini problems, but never really, I couldn't choose what is my idea. Like I don't know what an idea is. So I'd love to hear
sure.
other people's thoughts on that.
Totally fair, right? And there are good reasons why that gets why it can be tricky, and why you feel like I could do it at all these different levels. Well, the answer to why you feel like you could do it at all these different levels is that you can do it at all these different levels. And so the challenge is really choosing for whatever purpose makes the most sense for you. And we can talk about that more. One thing with which to start. Now, at the broadest possible way to think about this, right? We could just say, all right, if the thing where you want people to end up is the library, right? You may not have thought about it, but the thing is just like, let's just get them in, right? Then what we're trying to do is back up and say, okay, let's figure out what question people are actively and knowingly asking right now that the library can answer. Now you're like, there's a bajillion. I know. So this is one of those places where my background as a marketer can come in handy, simply because it means think about it perhaps strategically from the organizational perspective, right? Is there a group of people who would be strategically useful for you to get in to to get into the library? Like, is there a group of people that you're trying to get in more? Yeah. Like who?
So for me, it's my board of commissioners. We have an elected 5 board of commissioners who make 90% of our funding comes from them. And not a single one of them seems to really understand what we do. And like, we need to educate them so they can become as fanatical about how awesome we are as our community is.
Right.
But I don't know how to get them in.
Okay. So so your board of commissioners sounds like, so in the book, I talk a little bit about when there's like an acting audience and an ultimate audience. And so correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like your board of commissioners, they're an elected body. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. So they are, in a way, right? They're the ones that you have to talk to, but they have an audience that they really care about. And that's the audience, right?
Yeah.
And so part of what you're thinking about here is through the lens of either the board in general or a specific board member, you want to be thinking about, what does that person care about in relation to the community? Right? So most of the time they have a platform or whatever, and they're all about X. And so in that position, what you're trying to figure out is, how do you present and create that narrative that says, because you want to help the community with X and the library does X, support the library. Do you see what I'm saying? Rather than just kind of like broadly say whatever, it's sometimes you start with saying, what do you know they care about? And this is a way in which politicians can be useful, where we usually tell you what they care about at some level. And so you can often use that to say, oh, okay, they're telling me that this is a priority for them. And your job is to figure out, how do you draw the connection between what they care about and what you have, right? And so that's really always what you're trying to do. And so when you're trying to figure out, like, well, am I answering it from like, why is the library important? Remember, I mean, again, the language I just used is not language that's in the book, but it is where my, over the year, over the time in between now, I've known it gotten to a point where it's a little bit more useful. Again, think about it in terms of, what is the audience actively and knowingly asking right now?
Okay.
And I know people, I know you would love people to like to think that people are walking around going, why is the library important? They're not asking that. They're not, right?
Yeah,
They're not asking
right.
that until you ask them for things like money and funding. And then they're
Right.
like, why is it important? Right. And so we want to do is we want to get ahead of that. And we want to get in front of them and say, this is what I was talking about. Like, what do people care about? Like, what is it they were doing? Now, I'll give a very personal example with the start of my doctor program this summer, because all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, the librarians know everything about how to find stuff. Right. And also are an extraordinary resources for the very pain in the butt citation system of APA, which I have to use. And so like, all of a sudden, like now, just as an example, like if you've got, I mean, I know this is not necessarily applicable across the board, but that's just a tiny, tiny example of here is a very consistent problem that like new students are coming into. Now, I'm a special case. I have been out of school for 30 years. Why I'm doing this now, I don't know. I do know, but I'm insane. But like things have changed. Like when I got my master's degrees, like the screens were green. Okay, like, and Netscape was a huge deal. So like the whole idea, and the last time I did a research paper prior to this, like it was index cards in a box, right? And so lots has changed. So that's a very special use case of just like when the, you know, if I were to see like the library, right, at Teachers College say to me, try to figure out where to start with your research. Do you want to know how to set up this up so it's easy? I would have been like, oh my gosh, sign me up. Not just let us introduce you to the library. It was like, here's a very specific thing that you're trying to achieve. Guess what? We do that. Right. So I would imagine, because you've said that, that each of you and libraries in general have so many more things that I don't even know about. Right. But, and sometimes you don't even know what you have that might be of interest. So again, it just so happened that when we had our library tour at Teachers College, the librarian mentioned that they had all the dissertations of the Teachers College digitized from time immemorial. Well, it just so happens that my grandfather went to Teachers College and got his doctorate at Teachers College as well. And so that was a problem she didn't even know I had, right? But just again, by allowing me to just have that moment, I was like, oh, so I got it. I got the electronic copy. I sent it to my father and uncle. And I'm like, just in case, like you wanted to see this or whatever. I'm like, I'm sure you have the print copy. And they said, no, we don't have the print copy. This is now the only copy of the dissertation that we know exists in our family. So again, these are kind of some of those things where like it's, you never know, but back to your original question, Leslie, this is about thinking strategically about who is it that you want to get, right? Like who needs to come in? Who can you help? Who will help you? Who by helping them will help you as the organization? And then what do you already know about what they care about? And then you're using that structure of saying, hey, you know that you have this goal. Here's something that you don't necessarily know is getting in the way, but we have the answers to that. So therefore here. And oh, by the way, let's talk to you about how easy that is, how simple that is, what else we can solve for you. All right, that was a very long answer to your question, but hope. Do people still use it?
Very helpful. Thank you. That really helps a lot.
Super. What else?
Yeah, people always do say that. People still use the library, and it's very frustrating.
Well, I mean, see, that's the thing. I mean, I think that in a way, I observe the challenge that you all have, but I also observe the extraordinary opportunity, because, you know, again, speaking from somebody who is not a librarian, but I think it would be very easy, and correct me if I'm wrong, for people to think, what do we need libraries for? Everything's digital.
Sure.
Right? What is actually even in the library anymore? And so it was really actually fascinating for me to walk into the libraries at Teacher College and like see what they did with everything, because the number of actual physical books in there is now no longer nearly what it is.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the very challenge that people say, well, why do we need libraries anymore, is, and from what I understand, one of the very challenges that you all are uniquely qualified to solve, which is, how do you make sense of all of the information that's out there? How do we find information when you need it, when it's out there, right? And yeah, of course, like there's going to be, depending on people's sophistication with research and their abilities, there's going to be certain things that, can they just Google it themselves? Yes. But again, there's creeping into people's awareness that that's not always trustworthy. And depending on what people's goals are, again, I'm having a new appreciation for this from like returning to academia, like that there is value in the information that is actually not as easy to find. So let me give you a particular example of that. Actually, it was something that our professors remarked on. He said, well, you know, when people are going back and they're looking for support for some idea that they have, a lot of times the bias is to the recent information, right? But a lot of times the recent information, the recent article, is a regurgitation, a synthesis of information that has come way before. And so if you really want to understand kind of the nature of where something came from, you actually need to go all the way back to the original primary document to go back and look and to say, well, where did this start? Right? Where did it start? The interpretation, synthesis, absolutely important. But where does it start? Right? So that can, you know, again, we can talk about, so, you know, just even from there, you've got some opportunities for how you could position, how you could help, for instance, people who are trying to differentiate their marketing. If you're trying to figure out people who are trying to, if you've got people who want to be thought leaders, right? Help them understand where the real opportunities are in the market for those thoughts based on where they came from, where they're going, where to look at, what are people missing that's out there, based on the fact that people haven't, you know, that people are just kind of like top cycling this other stuff. Like there's probably an extraordinary stuff like deeper in, right? And then once you start understanding one topic, you start to understand how it radiates out. So, you know, yeah, my bias, as I'm thinking about, is from a thought leadership standpoint, from a positioning standpoint, but also, again, you all have such a huge knowledge of what it is that you know, can do, can help people find, and how, that it's a little bit of kind of looking at and saying, what are all of the things that could help solve? So,
Yeah.
Dana, is that correct? Am I saying that correctly? Fabulous. Question about making the pitch. All right, let's go.
Yes. So I guess when we identify our idea,
yeah,
and we kind of flesh out the need, you know, the thing that people need that they don't have that we can resolve.
Yep.
Then commonly we're taking that to our first leader, you know, our first manager.
Yep.
Making the pitch to them, and then from there trying to get enough traction to make it go. So there's what's in that first pitch.
Yep.
How do I prepare them for the second pitch that they might be doing the pitch, not me.
Yep.
And then like how far down the road do we start charting out things just to realize,
just to get just to get one program approved, right? You're like, come on. Well, one approved. Okay.
Yeah.
So the way that I found that is the simplest for all of that is, and I hope that this is a relief to some extent, is that first and foremost, like think of it as nesting dolls, right? The Vitrushka dolls. And you know how like in nesting dolls, that little one, that core one is solid, right? There's one that doesn't open anymore. But each of the ones that go around it contain that one and also are influenced by the shape of that one. And so the equivalent when you're thinking about messaging and creating a pitch around an idea or a program or the library in general is that your ultimate audience, the people that you are ultimately trying to get to act or to do something, is the equivalent of that solid core of the center. Meaning before you worry about pitching it to your first manager and giving, like, you need to understand, why would that person do this? The core person, like the audience, the group of people, whatever that you're trying to get in. What is the case for them? What is the need that they have? What is the problem, you know, that's getting in the way? What's that truth that all adds up to, you know, they need X, and therefore either we library need to advertise or market that we have X, or we need to develop a program that does X. And oh, by the way, we can do that because we have these two components already, right? So by figuring that piece out, because every other conversation you're going to have has to contain that one. Because if you think about your first leader, instead of just saying, we need this new program, why? Because it's going to help us do that. Now you're like, well, these people want this, and they have this problem, and you know, and then you're telling them that piece. And so that's why, because you, first leader, first manager, have this goal, we need to do this, right? You're kind of attaching this extra, like you're kind of like creating like pre-goals that ultimately the core of the argument is still, because these people want this and we have that, we need to do this, right? So it all contains that. And that's why I'm saying, like, focus on that one first. And then oftentimes, because, you know, what I've tried to achieve with the red thread is being able to articulate that narrative, that case, that story in fairly straightforward language and concepts. Typically, by giving them that structure, you are also arming that influencer, let's call them, with the language for them to continue forward. Because they're going to know who they need to pitch to, and they're going to have to include that core pitch anyway too, right? And that's where, you know, you can also help and say, like, I know that your next step after this is to talk to this person or get it approved by these people. We know they're interested in this. Here's how it does that, right? And how it does that is because it's doing this for these people that you need, right? So you can start, it really isn't just a complete reinvention. It's just putting kind of layers of containers around it to say, you want this. And ultimately, you're kind of, all of it still passes through that core message to that core audience that you're looking for. Yeah, the biggest nightmare, making someone else make my pitch, especially when they don't really understand it. Okay. Yes. So this is part of, honestly, why I try to develop the red thread in the first place, was because it is a structure of information that tends to make intuitive sense to people. And generally, if we've walked through it this way, we are not falling into the trap of leading with the complexity, right? And the expertise and sophistication level that you have. We're leading with where people are, and we're moving to that. So one of the things to understand, and you've probably figured out, and it's now wildly clear to me as I'm in academia, is that the structure of a message that follows the red thread is almost completely reversed of the typical scholarly academic presentation of information. Because it's not, here's the conclusion, let me defend it, and then now let me restate the fact that I've defended it. It is, you want this is in the way, and yet we believe this, which means this piece, but that's not all, because this other thing is true. So we need this piece, which is why, right? So to get all fancy on you, and I know I can't because you're librarians, well, the traditional academic presentation of information is inductive reasoning, or deductive, inductive reasoning. Basically, here's my evidence, let me draw these big conclusions from it. The red thread is presenting a deductive argument. We agree these principles are true, therefore this answer should be true in principle, right? And then essentially what the actions do sometimes is, and that's where you attach your inductive argument after that. Once you've said this, so because this person wants this, and this idea, this concept is necessary to solve this, and this idea, this concept is necessary to solve this. That's why this program, this approach should work. Now let's give you the evidence that supports this conclusion. And then by the time you've done that, you've kind of taken care of it 8 ways to Sunday, right? Like they've agreed with it in principle, and you've provided the evidence to allow them to agree with it in practice as well. Does that help? Because sometimes it sometimes means making a big shift mentally of saying, okay, this is the answer. Here's why, feature, benefit. It's here's why from a principle standpoint, from a big ideas that we all agree are true, right? So kind of the next book presents this to some extent, but the big hypothesis of that book, the big thesis of that book is that if we're trying to get people to buy into something, so forgive the capitalist language there, but if we're trying to get people to understand and agree with something enough to act on it, then one of the best ways to do that is to A, build a story, because that's how they're going to make that decision, but B, build it with things that they are already understanding and in agreement with. So if they already understand this question is out there and they already agree that it needs to be answered, and you're supporting it with principles that they already understand and agree with, and you create a conclusion that is the combination, Aristotle, thank you again, of those principles that they already understand and agree with, they should, if they're generally rational people, agree with that conclusion, again, in principle. Are you safe? No, you still need to defend it from from an inductive standpoint, but that helps you do it. So this all does get back to Leslie, your comment, which is by creating that kind of deductive, everybody agrees argument, right? To start with, don't we all agree? Do you agree this is true? Do you agree this is true? Great. That's why we believe, or I believe, that this will work. It gives people much easier ways to make that argument for you, because they're not having to argue it on the detailed, sophisticated evidence. They're arguing for it in principle. And you, being your talented selves, have already supplied the evidence. So if anybody has those deeper questions, they can go talk to our librarians. They know this is the detail, this is the pen, or you supply that additional detail for them. So, and these are the problems I observed as well. And so I was trying to solve for them, because that happens all the time where somebody else has to explain it. And the problem is when someone doesn't have your same level of expertise, and same level of background knowledge, they literally cannot explain it the same way. So what our job is, if we're trying to get that message, that program, that idea across, is to find the concept that explains it accurately, right? But maybe not comprehensively. So there's a great principle that I stumbled upon recently called Gall's Law, Gall''S, Gall's Law, or Gall's Principle. He was a systems thinker, pediatrician, polymath kind of person. And he said that when it comes to systems, that a complex system that works is based on a simple system that works. And so in a lot of ways, that's what we're trying to do here with the red thread, is that you generally have a very sophisticated, complicated, complex idea. But if it works because there is some series of much simpler principles and concepts upon which it is based that also work. And so the key to getting that understanding of people who don't have your same level is to take it to its simplest principles, which means the explanation will be straightforward, but you will still have the ability to add the complexity later, which I think is really important. I do a lot of work with academics, not only myself, a lot of scientists and engineers and technology. It's like we're not trying to oversimplify. We're trying to make the concept straightforward so that we can give people those conceptual bedrock upon which we can then layer up, right? So you can say, do you understand it at this level that, in order for somebody to act on something, they have to understand it and agree with it? Great. With me? Super. What do they need to understand? Well, people use story to understand. What do they agree with? Things they already agree with. Still with me so far? Great. So that's why we're building a story based on what people already agree with. Now, but what kinds of stories? Well, ultimately, all stories are an argument. So we're actually looking at a very specific form of argument called a syllogism, right? I'm not starting with syllogism. Somebody's never like, you know, so I have to like build them to it. And that's just usually I'm giving it to them as a toss off. And I'm like, it's called a syllogism. Don't worry, it's not on the test. And then kind of move on and say, all right. And again, what are these things that we already agree with? These are these kind of baseline principles and beliefs, right? That are a layer up from kind of primal beliefs that we have, but are below kind of these identity beliefs that are getting in the way of so much right now, right? There are things like what goes up must come down. There are these kind of functional things, these simple concepts upon which extraordinary complex concepts are based. But fundamentally, you know, there's almost always those things. So again, very long answer to that question, but hopefully that context is helpful.
I think if I can just
go ahead,
add on to
Victoria.
that.
Yeah, please.
One of the things that I found most interesting in the book was you had a section in there about parables, and that kind of relates to all of this conversation. But it had me thinking. I have a background in fairy tale studies in undergrad, and in a lot of fairy tale studies, the story leads up to, in a lot of, especially in like coming out of the French Salon movement, a lot of the stories were told leading up to a moral, and that moral would sometimes be explicitly written out as sort of a parable format. And so it had me kind of thinking of that method of telling a compelling story and then coming up with that short, sweet message after that, which I thought was a really interesting, because I'm trying to, as I was reading through this, I'm trying to prepare a conference presentation. And I was thinking through like, okay, I got to come up with my general topic sentences. And then underneath that, I have to defend that with, you know, main points and that sort of academic format. But I think this restructuring is going to be more helpful in making it more applicable to people and in telling that story in a more compelling way. So thank you.
You're welcome. It does. Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, part of what informed this, you know, Chris mentioned it was, you know, I do speak and was helping speakers. And it was really interesting because part of what you know, basically forced this type of approach was the fact that, you know, TED style talks have this time constraint on it. And so I'm dealing with academics that usually have hundreds of pages to get their point across. And now like from a word count standpoint, like it has to be under 2,200 in order to fit in 18 minutes. So we're trying, like, all of a sudden it was like, well, how do I take like somebody's entire body of work and get it down to 2,200 words? And what you're saying, Victoria, is precisely the concept, which is fundamentally all of that comes down to the morals of the story, the idea, right? So when that old storytelling maxim that a story is an argument, a story, whatever it is an argument for an idea. So if we're talking about fairy tales, if we're talking about Aesop's fables, ultimately they're an argument for that. Stories don't always articulate that out loud. There is a cool fun fact about movies though, where oftentimes on page 5 of the script, they will reveal the theme of the movie, which is so awesome. Other issues with the actors aside, there's a great example of this in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, where literally on page 5 of the script, they're talking about a palimpsest painting, and it's often what you don't see on the surface that's what's most important. And of course, that's exactly what the movie's all about. Very cool. Also true in Forrest Gump. So the point is, when we're trying to present this information, when we're looking for understandability first, and it seems so obvious in retrospect, and yet we skip over this step so often, is that understanding is the key, right? And if we don't get initial understanding of what we're talking about, why people should care, we've lost them right there, right? Which is why that kind of powerful articulation of something they want, don't yet have, actively knowing they want is so important, because it not only starts the story process in the brains, it creates curiosity, like, and relevance right away. Like, yeah, that's a thing I want, and I don't know what the answer is. And so, you know, by being able to state up, you know, you can state what the conclusion is up front, but from there, I would still say flip the order of how you go through it. And oftentimes that's the kind of happy medium with audiences like that, where they won't let you go forward really mentally unless they're like, okay, but what's your answer? Well, you can say, here's my answer, And essentially there's always a line that says, but let me back up. Right. And a lot of times actually what I'll do is say, here's my answer. Here are the reasons, here are the essentially the principles upon which, here's why that's my answer. Every decision has a story. You know, the stories we agree with are based on beliefs we already have. And so therefore, that's why I'm the answer, but let's back up. Right? Let's talk about this question. Why is it important? What, and then you can do the context of what's there. Why are there consequences? Why do we need to solve this question? What is happening? What are the typical approaches to it right now? What are they missing? Right? What is something that is in the picture, but we just don't have the spotlight on? But if we were to put the spotlight on it, all of a sudden we're able to see something differently than we could see before, right? What else? So that's how we could disrupt that status quo. What else could we put into play, right, in order to get there? What will create that last moment of truth that says, oh, right, you know, not only do we need this, we need that. And so therefore we put this together. Now, if you've warned them ahead of time what the conclusion is, now they're watching you build to it. But the other thing this does from an engagement standpoint is it makes sure that there's like an energetic arc to the presentation of information, right? You know, we know very well that the way the brain processes information is it takes it in, it attaches to what we already know, and then like it decides whether or not we need to keep it so it can recall it later. The problem with a lot of, not saying yours, but a lot of academic presentation is that sometimes it's like, here's my conclusion, here's point 1, here's point 2, here's point 3. And the only reason that they're connected is they happen to be presented together. So not only do we leave it up to people to somehow make the connection between these points, which they're probably not going to do, but the presentation of that information is by definition really linear. Point, point, point. Whereas a narrative introduction to this information, it basically starts to build. Here's this thing that we want, but we don't have it. Oh, but here's why. But how do we do that? But we know this. Oh, yay. Here's the solution. Here's how we do it. Okay, here's how we go, right? And if you've got a very limited amount of time, like a presentation or whatever, then the trick is not necessarily to separate the deductive inductive, but to kind of, one of my former bosses used to kind of marble in the evidentiary support like at those different points, right? So that by the time you get to, so here's what we have to do, you're not dropping back into explanatory detail. You're just referencing what you've already put out there and now drawing it all together for them. And the thing is like, I think we oftentimes undervalue, depending on where, like a job aid, a handout, an appendix, something like that, where you can present the information kind of any way you want, as long as at some point you give it to them the way they expect, right? So you could also say, like, present it beautifully and narratively and be like, and here's the academic version. Right? Like you can go to this link, or you can, here's where it is, or what, like, so that they can go back and they can justify for themselves that it's been there. So there we go. Does that help, Victoria? I mean, yeah, make it a fairy tale. I can't wait to hear what that is. I just like, yes, if you know this, like, it can be so fun to try to think about that. And actually one of my colleagues, Nick Morgan in the space, he talks about, he looks at it as 5 different story styles. The University of Vermont has shown that there's actually 6. So, but he actually talks about them, starting anywhere from like Vonnegut's original idea that there's certain shapes to stories. But Nick really talks about it as genres, and all the genres, because we've done some work together, all have these 5 elements in them. They just start them in slightly different places. So Nick thinks about it from like, I may not come up with all 5 of his genres, but one of the things is like, once you have these 5 things, you can think about, well, how would I present it as a love story? Right? How do I present it where the audience wants a thing, meets the thing, loses the thing, gets back together with the thing, right? Like, and a lot of times marketing concepts are very good for love stories, because there's a lot of times where we want this to happen, but we're doing something that forces them away, but we need to figure out how to like make ourselves you know, like build a healthy relationship from this and move forward. So that's one type of story. The hero's journey / the quest is another type of story. Nick talks about a revenge story, right? There is kind of the classic rags to riches story, right? Where that's, you know, there is, so sometimes you can actually, once you start to play around with these narrative elements, and again, you're not necessarily saying once upon a time, you're just structuring it that way, where instead of once upon a time, you're saying, well, all of us as library marketers have this challenge, right? Or if you're telling like your own case study, I had this question, right? And this is where you can imagine yourself being Moana singing about what she wants, right? But this is what, you know, this is what you're retelling for people. And what I've just seen over and over again is that, and what oftentimes I hear, what people report back to me is that when they structure, whether it's spoken content or written content this way, what they hear and they're amazed by is that people go, I was interested the whole time. Like I was engaged the whole time. And what is really interesting about this to me is that I call it Mary Poppinsing. You can oftentimes get people to understand and get excited by concepts that most people would, I think, generally go, you could never talk about that from the stage, or you could never write about that. And whenever somebody says something like that, I'm like, oh, show me. So I have an entire keynote that's about syllogisms, right? But I'm talking about it in terms of like Star Wars and like whatever. And but it's all architected from that concept of, you know, in that case, I'm talking about how most marketing and sales messaging just presents a problem and a solution. And the thing is, if you just present a problem and solution, A, no argument, but B, if you take it into a story, that's like basically saying like, well, there once was a bratty kid named Luke that wanted to be a pilot and he shot the Death Star and saved the galaxy. And you're like, something happened in the middle there and we missed it. And so like, that's essentially the whole concept of the talk, is to go, we can't skip the middle, right? Because without the middle, the story doesn't work, argument doesn't work, etc. So again, but by architecting it in a different way, right? People come after it thinking like, wow, I just learned about syllogisms, I just learned about all of this other stuff, and since one of my examples is the sham wow guy, it's a heck of a keynote. You know, you can start to have fun with it, is kind of what I'm saying. It's just like, and Lord knows a lot of these conferences, it could help, just saying. So other thoughts, questions? Yes, Jeannie. Yeah, no, you're muted.
Okay. I have a question. So I come from advertising, you have to get people in the door. So it seems like we've got, especially at our library, we have two different threads. The first one is people coming into the library for like information and things like something tangible.
Yep.
The other thing that's incredibly popular, especially at this library, are the programs.
Yeah.
So you don't take something away, but how do you promote that? So this past week we were promoting, I've been on part-time promoting the programs.
Yeah.
I rarely have time to promote the things. We did a kind of an about face that there were some programs, and we went and we showed them what we have done in the programs and the kind of the fun stuff.
Yeah.
But so how do I get a balance between, it seems like these are two concurrent threads. People are coming up. Right?
Yeah. So my first instinct, and this may not work at all because it, you know, I don't know everything about, like, I know actually very little about libraries. Let me just be very clear. At least from your perspective. I mean, it's a science, for goodness sakes, right? Library is a science, like library science, which is amazing. And I love that. I would come at it, also continue, like, build on your strength of advertising, Jeannie, and say, okay, remember what we're always trying to do is not just get them in the door, we're trying to get them to take the next step. So what I would think about is almost take a lesson from gosh, I hate to use this, but it's actually a really good example of like content marketing or internet marketing, right? Where you engage with something like a free webinar, right? And at the end, there is a clear, where do I go next with this to take the next step if I'm interested? And so one of the things I would think about just off the top of my head is to say, what could be opportunities at the end of a program? Like what services the library offers beyond the program could tie into what the program was just about or what the program just did. Right. So is there ways to explore further? The ways to like, is it, if it's a format, is there more information on the format? If there is if they want to get deeper, if they want to learn more about this, that, or the other thing that was presented, like what else is there? And really start to think structurally about what in the library do the programs point to? And use the programs not just to get people in the door, but use the programs as a way to introduce people to how to use the library in a different way. Not just, hey, here's what we've got, but really think thoughtfully about, we've got a program on X. What else could we, like, if somebody wanted to take the next steps, what are like 3 different next steps they could take within the library to follow up on that or to follow into some kind of deeper interest that they might have? So I would just start to think of it as like, forgive me, but it's like, think of it as like customer journeys. Like, okay, if they're here and we've got them here, what are some options for the next steps, and give them those options. Options are important because otherwise we start to engage like, but just let them go and say, hey, there's more. Like, you love this, there's more. Here's what that could look like. That's my first thought on that. I got some hearts. So good.
Thanks so much, Tamsen. And thanks, Jeannie. Great question. Great questions, everybody. I wish we had so much more time. Tamsen, this is amazing. So I can't wait for your next book. We're going to get it on our to be read list. And I'm guessing we can pre-order that. Is that
you can? It's available for pre-order now. So yes.
Okay. What else have you got going on that we should
know about? I think the best place to keep your eyes open for things is at what I'm calling the Message Design Institute, which is kind of my big project for this year, and what my Teachers College eventual doctorate will help support. But I'm of the belief that this skill of being able to help people understand and adopt new ideas is something that actually is a core life and business skill. And I would also say it's not something that we are regularly taught anywhere. And even in the places where you think that you would get taught, you're not. So the Message Design Institute, exactly what I'm trying to do with that, to provide kind of a meeting place of resources and education for both scholars and practitioners, all the people generating the information that affect the inputs of message design and the kind of the applications, where do we go and put them all together. There's a newsletter that's coming out for that, but I think that's the best. The newsletter is a great way to know what's getting launched in what order, but that's coming within the next 6 months.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. Yes, we'll follow that. We'll get the newsletter. I'll make sure to share it with the group. And we'll be sharing this recording because I'm sure other people are going to be just blown away to listen. This was just fantastic. And I can't wait to read it. And on behalf of everybody here, I'm sure I speak for everybody when I say thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure. You all do important stuff. So I thank you for the work that you do. I'm going to guess that you don't hear it enough. So let me make sure that I tell you, like, it is incredibly important. Like I said, your ability to make sense of extraordinary information that's out there and to help people make those amazing, unexpected connections is a critical need in our world going forward. And so, whatever I can do to help you all, I am happy to do it.
Thank you. If you can do one more thing, Tamsen, if you can pick a number between 1 and 11, somebody will win a copy of our book for next month.
8.
Okay, let's see. 10, 9, 8. Leslie Marinelli, you win a copy.
No way! I've never won. I'm so excited.
And our book next month is I Hear You by Michael Sorensen. So it's all about relationships and how to use those and make our work and our lives better. So that should be pretty cool. But thanks again, Tamsen. We look forward to following you, and we look forward to hearing more. And we hope that when we read See What You Can on Here, or is that what it's called? Did I totally screw it up? Oh,
say what they can say here. Yeah.
Say what they can on here. It's not an example of people being able to see things they can hear. So
yes, well, I created a URL for it that's just Little Change Book, so you don't even have to remember that. It's just littlechangebook.com because it's
very nice.
Littlechangebook.com. So
that's a really easy way to remember it.
There you go. Yep.
But thanks again. Thanks everybody. Thanks Tamsen, and everybody. We'll see you next month, Tamsen. Best of luck on your doctorate, and we can't wait to hear more.
All right, take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.